My mommy doesn't hate me. Because I'm special and unique. Because there's never been anyone like me before. Ever. Mommy loves Martin because he is real and when I am real.
What is real? Everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today's episode is so much fun. We are going to explore AI, artificial intelligence. It's a weird title for an interesting movie. Kind of gives you Pinocchio vibes. Pinocchio is featured in the movie. Pinocchio just came out on Disney Plus with live-action Tom Hanks as Geppetto. So many Pinocchio references. But I want to start by explaining the movie, just in case this one passed you by. It's sort of a under-the-radar Steven Spielberg movie, mainly because it didn't get a lot of good critical response back in 2001. So the movie did come out in 2001, and there are quite a few people that you are familiar with associated with this movie. So first and foremost, Steven Spielberg directed it, wrote the screenplay from Brian Aldiss's short story called Super Toys, last all summer long, and then the screen story by Ian Watson. And it stars our pal at this time, Haley Joel Osment. Yep, he was coming off his wonderful performance in The Sixth Sense, and in this movie he plays a robot. And this robot, they refer to as mechas. This particular robot is meant to be a son and to be loved. A couple of other names that are associated with this movie. Jude Law plays a sex robot called Gigolo Joe. Frances O'Connor plays Monica Swinton. And William Hurt is in this movie. You know, rest in peace to William Hurt. But I gotta tell you, the one that threw me, because I haven't seen this movie in like 20 years, the one that threw me, Clark Gregg is in it. all they get are the credit of super nerd. They work for William Hurt's character, Professor Hobby. Hobby, what an interesting name. But that's all they get. They're all just super nerds, which is amazing. Eugene Osment is one of those super nerds, Haley Joel's father, which I think is pretty cool. So if you haven't seen this one, I do recommend it. It is a great story, not about artificial intelligence, even though that's what it's called. It's actually about a story of love and what it means to be real, which brings up the idea that you find in the early Pinocchio story, right? And the story that sort of lasts in there, something that is not real but seems and acts real. Is it real? And we're going to explore these questions. I've got a wonderful guest host for you today. So let's jump right into it, shall we? My guest host today is Jim Davies. Dr. Davies is a professor of cognitive science at Carleton University. That's in Canada, not to be confused with Carleton College, which is in Minnesota. He is an award-winning instructor and is also passionate about the relationship between psychology and science fiction, having contributed to Star Wars psychology, Star Trek psychology, and Doctor Who psychology. He is also the author of several popular science books. He is the perfect person to have on this show. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you even have a podcast about psychology in movies. It is much needed in this world.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I am super happy to have you here. And what I do with the instructors and psychology professionals that come on the show is sort of get a broad sense of how one uses film in their classes. And so that is the same question I have for you. Your broad thoughts on film, and do you use it in your teaching? And if you do, how do you use it in your teaching?
I think it's really important to try to relate science to things that students can relate to whenever possible. It can be pretty abstract. Psychology is better than chemistry, but still there can be some very abstract concepts. And just about everybody consumes art of one kind or another. So, I think that's a great place to start. And, among the arts, the narrative arts are often the best ones for psychology, because narrative involves characters and minds. Like, you can't even really define a story without talking about characters in conflict. Is in contrast to, say, music or paintings, they can be very abstract, right? But a story always has psychology, So anyway, I only teach one class, but in it I show the movie Memento, which it's got 1,300 students in it, but I only teach one. And I show Memento, which I know you've done 2 podcasts about. Everybody go back and listen to those if you haven't.
Thank you.
And then I have an entire class, an hour and a half, where I talk about cognitive science in psychology and psychology of the movies, or the cognitive science of those movies.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that you take the time to show your students Memento. I take the time to show my students Memento too, and we're coming on that movie being.
It really holds up.
It does, and it's 22 years old now.
Like I've watched it every semester, and I love it.
I get so much. I watch it every year when I teach cognitive psychology, and it never ceases to give me something new. I do have a question for you though, teacher to teacher. How confused are your students after seeing it?
I'm a little embarrassed to say I really don't know. I mean, I have 300 people in the room.
Yeah.
So it's not like we have a discussion about it, right? So,
fair. Yeah, that's fair.
But I love to see them gasp at different moments.
Okay, now that's
the
fun.
Kind of movie. Yeah, that's great.
That's fun. Well, no worries if that would just be too much. I would be curious though on the discussions afterward, because I know my students are like, "What did I just watch? What is this?"
Okay.
And I tell them after we're done, that they can go find the recut version that is in chronological order as far as the events of the film. And I tell them if they really want to, put all the pieces together, to go do that. It's going to ruin the movie experience that Christopher Nolan wanted for you. But, you can, if you need that help.
Well, I think that I've seen that. And I want to say that I think it actually adds to it, because it shows you the story from the other character's point of view. That's the thing I take away from it.
Oh, that's true. I never thought of it that way. It's
how they see what's going on to this guy. And you see they're just manipulating a confused man.
Yeah.
And I think that's and then when you go back and watch it in the way Nolan cut it, it makes everyone a little more sinister, I think.
Oh, I never even. Oh, okay. I'm going to do that. All right. I am definitely going to do that. I appreciate that extra. See, you watch it again, something new. I love it. Well, let's pivot to our discussion of the film today, which is artificial intelligence, or excuse me, AI, artificial intelligence. It's a very clunky title in my view. But Jim, I have I'm curious as to, in your list here, I know I technically chose AI, but why would you include AI in a list of AI, artificial intelligence, in a list of movies to chat about?
I'm a cognitive scientist, and one way that I distinguish cognitive science from psychology is that cognitive science is interested in minds, no matter what form they take.
Mm-hmm.
So we're humans, animals, aliens if they exist, and artificial intelligences. So, ideally looking at the way minds work and the requirements for certain processes like planning or memory, abstracted away from the specific organisms that we happen to study. And my PhD is in artificial intelligence, technically
Amazing.
computer science, but I did a artificial intelligence dissertation. There are lots of movies out there that deal with psychological things like trauma and personality and emotion. I feel like if you're teaching a personality class, you could use almost any movie that's ever been made to get examples from. But for cognition, like specifically,
yeah, right. that's the nature of the podcast, right?
Yeah, or emotion or personality or conflict or trauma, like every movie, right? But if you're talking about cognition, like cognitive psychology, or like movies that are actually about cognition, the nature of memory, the nature of imagination or planning, I think those are harder to come by. And I found when I was doing my review of movies that were relevant to it, it was mostly artificial intelligence stuff. So, there are lots of movies with artificial intelligence, even if they don't call it that. But, you can talk about the realism and the methods of artificial intelligence with respect to the movie.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the distinction and how many films on just thinking are, what if a robot was doing it instead of a person? I do agree that that's what you find here. But I love that your PhD is in, artificial intelligence / computer science, because I tell my students that, computer scientists kind of came up with this word in the mid 20th century, or this phrase, and they're like, psychologists tell us what we need to do to make thinking machines, and psychologists were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so thus started this sort of decade upon decade of trying to figure out what thinking is, and then maybe we can tie it to robots or other computer systems like we've started with.
Yeah, before there were computers, and software, there wasn't even the right metaphor for understanding cognitive psychology, right? So it was just the whole, behaviorism. Like I had one of the last behaviorism instructors at Georgia Tech. Jack Marr was his name, and he would teach this class, and he would, like, every time somebody would mention memory or something, he would drop his keys. He would hold his keys up and drop them, and he'd say, "Where's a memory? Show me a memory. How much does it weigh?" But now everybody knows that, like, a Microsoft Word file doesn't weigh anything, but to say it doesn't exist is absurd.
Right, exactly.
So now, so I have sympathy for those psychologists of the past. They didn't have an information processing metaphor to build their theories upon. So of course, they needed the computer and software to cause that explosion of progress.
Yeah, and I think that flows really well into the main segment here, where, because the title of the movie is AI, artificial intelligence, we do need to talk about how this movie does portray that. And it's not a lot, but what I wanted, Jim, is if for myself and the audience listening, if you could just describe what our current conception of AI is.
In the real world.
Yes, in the real world. And then we'll get to the movie.
Yeah, so artificial intelligence is the creation of intelligent artifacts, and by that we mean things that can do things that we would say humans require intelligence to do. Typically, that's things like planning and problem solving, and perception and imagination and creativity. But we design it instead of it growing, being based on genes and then learning everything from its environment. we design what it is. Now, most people think about computers, and I think of AI a little more abstractly. I think computers are the best way to build artificial intelligences right now, but I also have an open mind to maybe someday there'll be a different way to build artifacts that are intelligent.
Wow.
And I want to add another thing too, because although like a lot of what makes us what we are is what we've learned, right? Our experiences, we learn to talk, we learn to walk, we learn to do all kinds of stuff. And that's not in our genes. In the same way, the current trend of AI since for the last 10 years has been machine learning, which is interesting because we designed the learning algorithm.
Yeah.
But then it absolutely has to have enormous amounts of experience.
Yeah.
We call it data, but it's external to it to learn from, right? So, how artificial it is actually comes into question a little bit because with the modern methods, it's extremely challenging to even know what it did. So we don't program the computers to do what they're doing. We program them to learn to do it. And then we have to try to figure out, we have to do psychology on these deep nets to even figure out what the hell they're doing. So, it's like, are they artificial? Well, the learning algorithm was, but what they can do, they learn for themselves, which is not that different from animals and humans, right?
That's so fascinating. I got to tell you, the way that you just described that, I'm going to try to bottle that up. And because I this is like my intro lecture in cognitive psych, explaining the history. And that definition was really good because, we just think of computers and robots, and really there's a lot of ways that we can do this. I mean, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this just popped into my head. Could some of the mRNA vaccines that have been developed specifically for like COVID be considered something that is somewhat artificially intelligent?
I think that is pushing the definition a bit.
That's fair.
I think you'd have to really stretch it to say so. I mean, like I don't know enough about RNA to say that it's actually involved in intelligent tasks. Like, is it making decisions? Is it perceiving? I have a pretty broad conception of cognition. So I think that our immune systems do perception. For example.
Yes.
Like the immune system has to do a perception job to know what's a foreign entity, for example. So I will grant them perception. What does the mRNA do? I would have to know more about what the mRNA does, but I'm pretty liberal.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah, it's just popped in my head because of you saying that, your broad conception of what could be an artificial intelligent thing, for lack of a better word, doesn't necessarily have to be a mechanical robot.
Right. Well, we talk about doing DNA computers. We talk about like quantum computers, but notice we keep adding the word computer at the end of that. But that's because a computer is also an abstract thing that is something that does computations. But by that definition, our brain is a computer too.
Yes.
So, but basically what I'm trying to get across is that the far future, our AIs might not be made of anything recognizably a computer from today.
I like that. And I think that is a good way to conceptualize the end of the movie, which I think we'll get to here in the next few minutes. So let's talk about the way that AI is shown in this movie. As we said, this movie came out in 2001, and there is really not a lot of information that some movies just sort of pile on top of you. As far as this is how this works and this is how this works, and we got to make sure the logic of our world is consistent. Otherwise, people aren't going to be able to suspend their disbelief, and it's all going to come crashing down. There's an early scene in the movie where William Hurt's character, Professor Hobby, which is quite the name, is describing to a group of people the conception of artificial intelligence that they have in their world at that time.
And not lacking in human response. And even pay memory response. How did that make you feel? Angry, shocked?
I don't understand.
What did I do to your feelings?
You did it to my hand.
Aye. There's the rub. Undress. At Cybertronics of New Jersey, the artificial being has reached its highest form. Universally adopted, mecha, the basis for hundreds of models, serving the human race in all the multiplicity of daily life. That's far enough. But we have no reason to congratulate ourselves. We are, rightly, proud of it. But what does it amount to? Sheila, open. Tell me, what is love?
Love is first widening my eyes a little bit and quickening my breathing a little and warming my skin and touching with
And so on, exactly so. Thank you, Sheila. But I wasn't referring to sensuality simulators. The word that I used was love.
And so I was curious for your take on this, Jim, as somebody steeped in this world, how you thought the portrayal of artificial intelligence in this early scene and then a few other scenes sprinkled about and its portrayal.
Yeah, so first of all, the movie is completely inconsistent on this. Like he says, "Oh, I want to make a robot that can love, or mecha that can love." They call them mechas in this movie. Everybody, if you haven't seen it in a while, and he goes up to this secretary mecha and says, "What is love?" And she talks about heart palpitations, and and you get this. You're led to believe that the robots are kind of like Data from Star Trek, which are these like completely, emotionless beings crunching through their algorithms, and they can't even give you a good dictionary definition of what it is.
Yeah.
But then, and then they create David, who supposedly can love, and this is actually a big deal. But we also see Gigolo Joe express enormous amounts of emotion really well. So
Convincingly well.
It's why was the secretary so crappy at it if a random sex bot out in Rouge City can get it? You know? So, this is, if we're just digging into like the world of the movie, what we know is that robots have been around a long time. There's one mecha that says he was on Time Magazine like 75 years ago or whatever. And they are made for specific purposes, but most of them are humanoid. Vaguely speaking, they're all two-legged. Like there aren't any like anything like you would see like industrial robots or anything. And artificial intelligences, except for Dr. No, are always embodied as mechas. So, in the scene with the Flesh Fair, we see mechas of different kinds. There's a nanny bot and a post office bot and a war bot, but it seems very clear to me that they already have emotion. So, that's a little bit of an inconsistency of the film. Now, I could talk about the role of emotion in actual artificial intelligence, but that's kind of my read on the movie.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll add here to this is something that I found to be really interesting when I was reading about the short story and then the conception of this film all the way back when the short story was written. So Stanley Kubrick was the person who was going to make this movie. But he didn't want to make it in the 70s when he bought the rights to the short story because he thought that a human would not be able to be mechanical, so to speak, act like a robot in the 1970s, and the special effects that existed at the time were not up to the task of creating an artificial being. And so he shelved it. And then he moved on to other projects and, started talking to Steven Spielberg quite a bit in the 1990s, and it ended up in development hell. And then Stanley Kubrick died in 1999, I believe, somewhere around there. And Steven Spielberg was like, I'm going to make this movie for Stanley. And he decided to go against what Stanley said and cast a real child in the role of David and give it a shot. So what do you think about Haley Joel Osment's portrayal of this character, David?
I want to add to your story that they actually had a prototype robot built to play David, and it was so horrifying and uncanny that it was very clear it would never work.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that is terrifying.
Yeah, and now we've gotten to the point where I still would argue we wouldn't be able to make a mechanical robot that would do it. We just have CG that's so good that if the movie were made today, we'd have a completely CG character, right? That's what Kubrick probably would have done.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Like, I think that having an actor is a lot cheaper, but it's also a really easy way to make you feel sympathy for David.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
David, and again, it's a little bit weird. Like the fact that Gigolo Joe is in this movie and he is so smooth and so like he looks a little bit fake, but he talks great. And then you get David just like bursting out laughing at nothing and acting like a weirdo.
Yeah.
As though this were like a way that robots are. Why didn't they make him as good as Gigolo Joe at being lovable?
Sure.
This is an interesting, problem with the film. But I think that casting a human was a great idea. First of all, like he needs to look like an advance over the other mechas, so he does look more realistic than Gigolo Joe, for example, who's got a lot of makeup on, for example, and certainly more than the more mechanical mechas that are in the film. But yeah, also like David's in almost every shot. Like you have to have the sympathetic protagonist. And I think that Haley Joel Osment is, probably the best child actor I've ever seen. So I think it was great choice.
Okay, yeah, I agree about the casting of Haley Joel Osment. So my follow-up question would be then, why would Dr. Hobby think that what he created, something that could end up so creepy, right? David in the first part of the movie, the first half of the movie, is so undeniably creepy that I don't know if anybody would love. I certainly wouldn't. So why did they make him? Why did they make him so creepy? I guess is my question. What about
given that they didn't have to,
and they didn't have to, right? Because as you say, Gigolo Joe's pretty smooth. Like take some of that code or whatever and give it to a small child. Not the sex stuff, of course, but like,
yeah.
I just don't understand the conception.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake in the world building, not an intentional thing. Well, I don't think it's an intention of Dr. Hobby. I think it's probably a mistake to look to Dr. Hobby for why wouldn't he put in that code? Like, why would he deliberately make him awkward? Because I just think it's a mistake in the world building of the movie that like they shouldn't have made Gigolo Joe so smooth, so that David's awkwardness would be like, oh, okay, well, all mechas are like that. But if we really wanted to like give a very generous interpretation of the script, maybe he thought that if the kid was too lovable as he was, people wouldn't ever activate the actual love, and he just wants that to be something that people can do. Or maybe now that we see pictures of Dr. Hobby's son, who basically is Haley Joel Osment. Yeah. So Dr. Hobby has a dead son, and he's building his son based on he's building David based on his memory of his own son.
Right.
Maybe his son had some kind of maybe his son was on the spectrum.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. I like the speculation.
Maybe he was trying to make him as much like the original David. Who knows?
Yeah, and the first time you see the movie and they arrive in New York is submerged in this 22nd century, but this is where Hobby's main office is, and you see this other version of David, and it's interesting because you don't know if this other version of David also had these activation words constructed, because there are a lot of different Davids and like boxes and things like that. So you're like, this is other levels of creepy. But I don't want to get too bogged down on that one, because my next question for you, again, is an AI-based question. And this is regarding consciousness. So do these mechas have consciousness in this film?
Yeah, this is something also very inconsistent in the movie, because that scene is you're led to believe that they don't. They have what? Okay, so here's we can throw in a little psychology here. Nociceptors are the physical mechanical cells you have that
Correct.
can detect harm, and many animals have them. And we think that it is possible to have nociceptors and to be able to respond to harm without any conscious awareness. Humans do it with many things. In fact, if you touch a stove, your hand will pull off the stove, and your consciousness only hears about it about a second later. Your brainstem takes care, or not your brainstem, your spinal cord takes care of you actually moving the hand. So we know that even humans can respond to what psychologists like to call noxious stimuli. They can respond to it in a way that you would expect without any conscious experience of pain. But then, later in the movie, at the Flesh Fair, there's a robot that asks to another mecha to turn off his pain sensors. Why would he do that? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, but it's a movie. It's a movie. We don't even know if the people were conscious in it. This is like one of the things about film that's interesting, is that unlike a novel, you never really get into people's heads in movies unless it's like a voiceover. So, and the only voiceover in this movie is from the mechas from the very end. So, we don't really know who's conscious and who's not, but they certainly act like they're conscious most of the time.
So this is a tough question.
Even David Pre-Love acts conscious.
This is a tough question, right? So I'm going to ask in your best elevator speech, what is consciousness for the listener?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked, because I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I'm writing my next book on consciousness, and so I've been like really into it. And the thesis of the book is that we don't know what the hell we're talking about.
That sounds like a great thesis surrounding consciousness. I tell you what, that's exactly how I teach it.
And I'll tell you, the reason I say that is because there are many theories of consciousness. I shouldn't say many. There aren't that many, but there are several theories of consciousness. And a recent survey of consciousness experts found that the top theory was only thought to be promising by 63% of
Okay, that's not very promising.
Researchers. It's not promising at all. So what this means is that there is enormous disagreement about what the correct theory of consciousness might be. On top of that, the theories that we have are very, very different.
Okay.
So the top theories are, and I'm not going to go into what they are, but global workspace theory, higher order thought theory, and integrated information theory are the top 3 consciousness theories out there. And they have radically different predictions about, for example, whether a computer or a computer software could be conscious, and under what conditions it would be conscious. Extremely different.
Yeah.
And so if you go by the field, like I've got my opinions about what consciousness is. Some, I'm a functionalist, which we can get into later, but I shouldn't be too certain about it. And since consciousness isn't my wheelhouse, I think that it is the way you should deal with a field that's not your wheelhouse is that you should look at the distribution of theoretical commitment, and your belief should be a probability distribution over that. So each theory's credence is based on roughly the number of people in the field who think it's
I agree. That's a good way to think about it.
So if you've got a field like consciousness, and maybe a topic like the concept of artificial consciousness, and there's enormous disagreement, and the theories don't even agree on under what conditions a machine could be conscious, then I think that we should have the rational thing to do is have enormous uncertainty about that. I don't know if I said what consciousness is. I mean, like what consciousness is it's very hard to explain to somebody who isn't conscious. Like that, but I think that we all have a idea. The best way to do it is to just sort of distinguish conscious from unconscious things, right? So sometimes, let's get into psych, right? So sometimes I will say things to my wife while she's typing something on her phone. I'll say, when are we going to dinner tonight? And she will store that in her sensory memory, her echoic memory. She'll finish typing. She'll look up. She'll listen to what I said in her head. And then she will answer. Okay.
Yeah.
And we all know that recording in echoic memory is uninterpreted. It is raw sound to the extent that the brain can do raw sound.
Right.
And I'm quite sure that she is not conscious of the content of the words. What do the words mean? What was the question I was asking? What was it? Without until later when she actually attends to it. So this is an easy case. Was she conscious of the meaning of what I said when it was only in her echoic memory? No. And then it became conscious. And so that's what consciousness is. It is the difference between the kinds of thoughts that you aren't aware of and then you are aware of. And the fact that we can have conscious and unconscious thoughts, I think, is the closest thing we can get to agreement on what consciousness is. Beyond that, you have to have a good theory. So to get better than that, you have to have a good theory, and then we don't have a good theory.
I think that's a good conception of the way that I teach consciousness, the way that, especially in a class like cognitive neuroscience, where we're having to apply the ideas that we've gathered from inferential behavioral experiments and apply it to what's happening physically and physiologically in the brain. It's a hard task, and I spend a good day/2 days of that discussion just picking the brains of my students, like, explain to me what you think consciousness is. And then I take that and I go, okay, well, we have our class definition, and let's apply it to the things that we see every day in life, right? Your example with your wife and hearing your question, but not being aware of it immediately. And so my next question for you then is, what would you say? I know this isn't the same thing, but what would you say would be the difference between consciousness, which potentially robots can have, and sentience?
Oh, sentience is a word that gets used in all kinds of ways. So, so I would argue that sentience is not a cognitive science term. I don't actually ever hear sentience used in cognitive psychology or in cognitive science with a technical meaning. Sentience is used in the popular vernacular, sometimes for consciousness, sometimes for intelligence. So that's ambiguous. And then in the ethics world, it means that they're capable of having valenced mental states.
Yeah.
So basically pain and suffering and joys and sorrows. So in ethics,
so that's where I was going with that.
Is a fly, we might say, like, is a perch sentient? What we're asking is, can a fish feel pain? Can a fish feel pleasures consciously? Right. So it's consciousness plus the capacity to have the contents of consciousness be valenced. So you could conceivably have a creature that was only conscious of the color blue, and it wasn't positive or negative. It was conscious of blue, but it wasn't good or bad. That wouldn't be a sentient creature. It would be a conscious, unsentient creature by the ethical definition.
So I want to take that ethical definition, because that's generally what I use because the term always comes up in a class, like I said, cognitive neuroscience. So I want to take that ethical definition because ethics are an interesting thing. I'm a chair of our IRB, and so I'm constantly thinking about ethics and the ethics of studies and all of that. And of course, we're talking about human participants at my institution, and never, a fish that is conscious of blue.
You don't do animal board. You don't do animal
No, we're
reviews?
not. We don't have any animal. We're too small. We don't have any animals. So.
Oh, nobody does any animal. So at my university, so this is interesting. Like with all the, if you're doing experiments on insects, you don't even have to apply. You just
Which
do
is
whatever you want.
wild to me because and it's not it and I haven't been in a project with insects, but I was a former mentor of mine, and his lab created this machine which purportedly crushed ladybugs. And
Okay.
nothing about the IRB review had to do with any ladybugs getting crushed. They did not get crushed. It just seemed like this machine was going to crush them. And of course, we have a random affinity for ladybugs because of the hungry ladybug or whatever, or the whatever the title of the book is. And so that's what they were trying to elicit a reaction from students. And so that was the review, like creating emotional distress in the participants rather than potentially crushing live ladybugs. Right? So I don't know about the whole insect thing, but that sounds reasonable because everything that I've come across as far as animal ethics goes, insects are not included. It's only mammals, right?
Yeah, and right. So and octopuses now, but
interesting.
yeah, octopuses recently have been made the cut. But again, this is all based on based on intuitions, and because we don't have a good theory of consciousness to tell us.
Yes.
Right. So it's really, we have to make decisions. This is why I think this field is so fascinating. In my last book, Being the Person Your Dog Thinks You Are, I spend hundreds of pages trying to figure out the science of how to be a good person. And it's unfortunate. And the reason I'm writing a consciousness book now is because I came to realize that figuring out consciousness is probably the most important scientific problem that the world faces.
Yeah, I agree.
Because knowing which beings are sentient, I should say, which beings are in consciousness is required for sentience, which beings are sentient or not, has enormous implications for whether we should be colonizing the universe, how we should eat. Like everything hinges on it. It's the only thing that gives the universe value.
Yeah.
So we're in a position where we've got terrible theories, but we have to make decisions about ethics. And so we just base them on whatever, So, you do whatever you want to insects.
Apparently. So taking the sentience bit here and applying it to the mechas that are in the movie, AI, would you say that based on the definition that you gave from an ethical standpoint, that these mechas are sentient and therefore potentially require more rights than they are given in this universe?
I think they're potentially sentient, but I don't think we have enough information. And what we get in the movie is somewhat inconsistent. So this flesh fair is really interesting because in the flesh fair, one robot asks to get his pain stuff turned off, but the other robots really don't fight for their lives. And in fact, one of the reasons that the people turn on the flesh fair when David comes out is somebody says robots don't beg for their life or something like this, which is curious. Like, Gigolo Joe makes himself an unlicensed mecha to avoid getting caught by the police for the murder he's framed for. So he says some sort of a life-preserving thing. They do run from the flesh fair people, but it's sort of like half-hearted. None of them are fighting. They're just running and hiding, and they don't put up a lot of resistance.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and children of all ages, what will they think of next? See here, a bitty box, a tinker toy, a living dog. Of course, we all know why they made him. To steal your hearts, to replace your children. This is the latest iteration in a series of insults to human dignity.
And in their grand scheme to phase out all of God's little children.
Meet the next generation of child designed to do just that. Do not be fooled by the artistry of this creation. No doubt there was talent in the crafting of this simulator. Yet with the very first strike, you will see the big lie come apart before your very eyes!
Don't burn me! Don't burn me! I'm not gonna hook you! Don't make me die! I'm David! I'm David! I'm David!
Mecha don't plead for their lives? Who is that? He looks like a boy.
Built like a boy to disarm us. See how they try to imitate our emotions now? Whatever performance this sim puts on, remember, we are only demolishing artificiality. Let he who is without sim cast the first stone.
It's curious to me. It seems that in recent work in artificial general intelligence, in philosophical work, has suggested that no matter what your goal is as a robot, self-preservation would help that goal.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to be a nanny bot, like there's a nanny mecha in that scene, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
She shouldn't want to die because that's going to prevent her good nannying.
I agree.
Anyway, so we just don't have enough. We just don't have enough knowledge. Like I think that like many movies, unless somebody in the movie on good authority tells you they are or are not conscious, we don't know. And in this movie, that doesn't happen. It actually doesn't really even talk about it.
Yeah, I saw that in our notes that we compiled for our discussion that you had mentioned Turing tests as a test for artificial consciousness or some kind of imitation game, and they completely passed that by in this movie. I don't think Steven Spielberg had any desires to explore consciousness or anything, because I think what he wanted, and this is me making assumptions about a famous director, but I think what he wanted the viewer to just do is ignore the AI stuff, regardless of the title of the movie, and conceptualize, as you mentioned earlier, Jim, conceptualize Haley Joel Osment as close to a human as the story would allow, while also knowing that he is, a mecha, and that he has some of these weird tendencies, like laughing. That scene is terrifying to me. I'd be like, nope, taking it back, get him out of here. So we're left with this situation where all of that stuff is ignored, where it's in other AI films, it's part of the narrative, like Ex Machina. It's the Turing test is the plot, or the. And I'm so glad you brought up like self-preservation, because Isaac Asimov, when he wrote his rules of automatons or whatever they were, whatever he called them,
laws of robotics.
Yeah, the rules of robotics. Thank you. And that were portrayed in the movie I, Robot, where self-preservation is against their programming, and except for this one. Who's, I guess, I don't want to get into that one. The movie is a mess. But we're not supposed. So I guess my point is here that we're not supposed to care if these machines in AI are real, conscious, or sentient. I think we're just supposed to care what happens interpersonally in this sort of Pinocchio way. What do you think of that?
I suppose, but at the same time, like there are lots of scenes of just mechas talking to each other. There's Teddy and David and Gigolo Joe and Dr. No, like long scenes where the humans are very peripheral. And I think that watching those scenes without thinking that they're conscious makes them really pointless.
Okay.
So I think that we see they're actors, they're acting, and we just assume consciousness. And
I think that's what I was
take seriously that they were unconscious for the entire movie. It would sort of be like, it would be like watching billiard balls knock around. I don't even know if it's possible for us to watch the movie like that, but if we were to, it would be. I think it would.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. Not that we don't care that they're conscious, but that we should conceptualize them as humans.
Yeah. It doesn't get into it.
In the nature of the story. And I don't know, does it sort of your final word on this, does it pass muster when it so when we take the whole movie's time scale from this 22nd century to the very end, 2,000 years later, does the conception of mechanical beings and the intelligence that these beings express, does it pass muster in your mind, in your opinion?
Like, is it realistic?
Is it realistic? Is it a decent portrayal? Is it a portrayal that you have significant qualms with? I mean, I know you mentioned the inconsistencies in the way that it's portrayed.
So as a movie, I think that movies and stories are they really have to adhere to characters and people and this kind of thing. I mean, I personally think that AIs are going to get extraordinarily smart, much smarter than we are. But I think that the majority of them, if there is more than one, is going to be not a disembodied AI, but basically kind of a world-spanning AI that has a million fingers or something. So the idea that they're going to be individuated robots that have to talk to each other in English is a little silly. You know, I mean, they, it seems like they would probably all be part of one mind, and the bodies would be, I mean, in 2,000 years, you know, they would probably create and destroy bodies with nanotech by the second every time they needed it or something. And that's very hard to make a movie about. So I don't fault Spielberg or the designers for not doing that, because you have to give the audience something that they can understand and grab onto. You know, and when you have aliens that are super weird, you can't relate to them. And I think a great example of that is Solaris and Stanislav Lem's stories in general, but the movies Solaris, where the point is the alien is completely incomprehensible, but it becomes for the psychology of the audience, it becomes this weird, horrific force, not really a character, because it has to be past a certain threshold of human life to count as a character in a story in the mind of the audience.
Yeah, I agree. It struck me, I thought they were aliens when the first time I saw the movie, and not advanced mechas, but it makes a lot of sense.
When did you find out they were mechas? Like yesterday or like 20 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't put a lot of thought into the end of the movie. I didn't remember the end of the movie. So I'm glad I rewatched it for our discussion, because the end of the movie was something that I had not kept with me, I suppose. And so when I saw it again, and they looked the way that they did with, you know, the typical elongated ovular face and very long spindly limbs, I was like, well, these are just humanoid aliens, and they found Earth just depopulated, I suppose, 2,000 years after the events of the film. But yeah, I mean, Gigolo Joe is right that mechas are going to be the only ones left.
That she does not love you, David. She cannot love you. You are neither flesh nor blood. You are not a dog or a cat or a canary. You were designed and built specific like the rest of us. And you are alone now only because they tired of you, or replaced you with a younger model, or were displeased with something you said or broke. They made us too smart, too quick, and too many. We are suffering for the mistakes they made, because when the end comes, all that will be left is us. That's why they hate us. And that's why you must stay here.
And that they had not, that they longed for humans to return, but could not figure out how to bring them back.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people made that inference, that incorrect inference that they were aliens. And I think it really hurt the movie's reception. A lot of people thought that it was stupid to have a whole movie that's very grounded and set in this sort of, world, and then suddenly to have aliens in the last 20 minutes. Just like, why, right? But I think that the movie made a mistake. Like, you could have just had a line that made it very clear that they were mechas. But it's a little, you have to read into it a little bit. And then the design, as you said, of those aliens looks a lot like what we tend to think aliens look like based on like Whitley Strieber's Communion and the gray aliens that are supposedly abducting people, which that design was created by an NBC artist a long time ago, but it sort of captured the popular imagination. I actually have a scientific paper on why that alien has to look like that and not something else, which we can talk about if you want. But and I ran an experiment on it. But Spielberg himself, with his movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, helped cement that image of what aliens look like in people's minds, and then screwed up by basically copying it with the serial number scratched off. No wonder people thought that they were aliens.
And I think that's what I had, because I had seen Close Encounters, before 2001. Not the movie 2001, but before the year 2001, and this movie came out, and I was like, oh, he's just returning to it's like almost like a Steven Spielberg shared universe, where he's like, I'm pulling from Close Encounters, and it's the same alien.
Oh my god,
that's what I thought back then. And just reading more about the story and your notes, and then seeing your notes in the context of the end of the movie again, I'm like, oh, of course they're just advanced mechas. Of course they are. This makes 100% more sense than just a random group of aliens.
So if I could, I do want to talk about this study I did, because I'm very proud of it. Basically, I had this thought that part of the reason that this whole alien abduction narrative is so convincing to so many people, even in spite of there being terrible evidence that it's real, is because those aliens are what's the word? It's a super normal stimulus of intelligent humans. So the supernormal stimuli is a psychology theory where, like, we evolved to like the taste of sugar, so we like fruit, but now we can make foods that have so much sugar that they taste better than anything in nature. And that's supernormal stimuli. Jessica Rabbit is like a supernormal stimulus of a beautiful woman. Okay. And so the aliens, those gray aliens, they're made to look intelligent. And if you manipulate any part of it, it makes them dumber. Give them a bigger nose, make them hairy, make them fat, make them have, like, you do anything to them, they get dumber.
Wow.
So I actually, like, and so like me, I know everybody's just listening, but if you look at a picture of me, I'm like, I look a little bit like one of these aliens, and I feel like I benefit from it. Like, I'm not a dumb guy, but I think people give me more credit. People give me even more credit because I match a stereotype of what they think an intelligent person is.
Sure. Yeah. I get you.
I'm male. I'm tall. I'm bald. I wear glasses. I talk fast. All these things work in my favor. And in this experiment, we manipulated the size of the aliens and the size of their heads and all these things, and asked people. We just showed them the picture and, like, on a Likert scale, how intelligent do you think this alien would be? How likely could But if I said, oh, I saw an alien. He came to me when I was in bed. He said, oh, really? What does it look like? I'm like, he was really fat with a long nose, and he stunk. He had hair coming out of everywhere, and he was snoring. And you're like, that doesn't sound like a space, like that doesn't sound like an alien that could create spaceships. And you're laughing because you see how ridiculous it is.
Yeah. You don't hear those stories.
At a very subconscious level, the fact that the alien looks like, it had a really big mouth and it was drooling. Like, no. So I think that the designers of the mecha at the end were sort of under similar constraints. Like, they just naturally wanted to make, well, if these are 2,000-year-old mechas, they got to look really smart. So what do you have to do? You can't make them fat. You can't make them have big mouths. They have no nose.
Yeah, right.
Big eyes.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. I gotta read this study. That's amazing. That is amazing stuff. Well, we're gonna take a quick break and come back and discuss the human, quote unquote, side of this story, the Pinocchio side of this story, with Dr. Jim Davies. Stay tuned.
Astrid here. You may know me as the other half of your favorite podcast host, Dr. Alex Swan, and I'm here to shout out listeners like you. Thanks for supporting the pod, whether that's buying merch, sharing episodes on social media, or making donations. You can visit cinemasitepod.swansite.com to get your hands on previous episodes, or if you're like me, just another hoodie because we live in the Midwest. We appreciate you. Now, back to the show.
And we are back with Dr. Jim Davies talking about AI, Artificial Intelligence, 2001 blockbuster-ish movie from Steven Spielberg. And we went in the first segment, we were talking about AI and consciousness. And in this segment, I want to talk about the overarching themes of this movie, which do still have a psychological bent to them, because these are topics that you can talk about in a science of relationships class, a social psych class, and still sort of in the realm of what makes things things in a sensation and perception class. What is real? So those are the two questions for this broad segment. What is real? What is love? And so, Jim, I mentioned before the break.
Let's not be too ambitious. We'll solve these in half an hour.
We were talking before the break about how this movie leans pretty heavily into the Pinocchio story. And it's kind of funny that we're talking about this movie and its connections to Pinocchio with the new live action Pinocchio just dropping on Disney Plus. I hear the first 10 minutes are the tear jerkiest of tear jerkers, like the first sequence of Up, if you're familiar with that one. Rough stuff, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm trying to convince the kids to watch it. So we have these big questions that Pinocchio, several decades ago asked, which was, am I a real boy? And is David a real boy, Jim?
Yeah, great question. So real, unfortunately, has multiple meanings.
I know.
So one sense of real is imaginary versus real. And in that sense, that's how we would say, like, Santa Claus isn't real, spoiler alert. Or, is God real? That's what we mean. Is it an actual entity in the universe, or is it some figment of the imagination? And in that sense, of course, he's real, right? He's real. He's you could knock him over. He was manufactured. But the other sense of real is only in reference to some other kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at AstroTurf and you say, is that real grass? Then the answer is no. Of course, the AstroTurf is not imaginary.
Right.
So it's a real object, but it's not real grass. So the question is he a real boy? Well, that depends on whether he counts as a boy or not.
Yeah.
And, under some, he's not a girl, but under some definitions he would be. But of course, he's not human. But the movie uses the word real a lot, and they almost always mean, are you a real human? And the answer is, of course, he's not, right? But, like Martin, he's like, I'm real, and you're Mecha. I like their Orga and Mecha contrast that they use. So,
Yeah, the Orga was a bit of a stretch for me, but Mecha is fine.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, he's not. I mean, what do we really disagree on here? He's not human.
Right.
We all know that. He's not imaginary. He's a mecha, and he's like made to look male.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and specifically made to look male because they found this family that worked for the company that was making the robots, right? And they were like, "This is perfect test case." The definition for real that I think that David is striving for when he sort of embodies himself as Pinocchio is authentic. Am I an authentic person? In the sense that, like, can I be, or at the very least pass for an entity worthy of regard from the Orgas in the world? So can I be authentic in the sense that maybe I'm indistinguishable from a real human? So that's the real that I pulled from that.
This talking about like this authenticity and how he should be treated, like whether he can pass for a human is one thing, and I think often he does, right? Like that's how he gets out of the flesh fair. But whether he deserves to be treated like a human is then we're back to sentience.
Yeah, that's true.
To me anyway, like he deserves moral. He's a moral patient. He deserves to be treated with moral respect. If he is conscious, if he's sentient, he can have like pain and suffering and joys.
Yeah, I like that addition. And I think where I'm going with the authenticity argument bleeds into David's quest, which is that he wants to be loved. I said regard earlier because I didn't want to jump into the love stuff immediately, but I guess we should, because his goal, his programmed goal, I guess, is how we have to characterize it within the context of the logic of the movie. His programmed goal is to love unconditionally, but he also wants to be loved unconditionally. So he wants to give the love, and then he wants to receive the love. And I think that's what Dr. Hobby was essentially trying to mimic there between two humans. But of course he's a mecha, and so he has to come to this love idea from a different angle than humans do. And so the question is, first, what is love? What do you think, Jim?
So, love, I think, is a word that gets broadly applied to, I think, three things. I wrote a blog post about it about 10 years ago, but it kind of corresponds to some neurotransmitters. So there's this like lust, there's a companionship friend kind of love.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like a nurturing kind of love. So the way many marriages evolve is that they start off with a lot of lust, and then it grows, the lust declines, and then the companionship and trust and caring grow. And anyway, but there are chemicals for these things. Like oxytocin doesn't make you horny, but it does make you feel nurturing and affectionate. So I think that love, part of the reason that love feels so mysterious is that we have one word instead of three. And a lot of the confusion would go away if we came up with three different names for this stuff. It's like, oh, do you still love me? It's like, oh, well, let me break it down for you. With this, you can love your best friend without like wanting to have sex with them, and you can love your dog without, So, that's what I think love.
That's a great answer.
I mean, well, okay. So it's caused. So it can be caused by these chemicals. I don't think the chemicals are love. Let me.
That's fair.
I think love is an information. Love is an information processing event. It is a state of mind. It is a way of thinking that we subjectively feel in terms of more basic things like lust and caring and companionship and
Right. Now, in the movie, Monica, the mother, who is at first sort of in a hopeful but also grief state because her real son, is in some sort of stasis because he has some sort of disease. And so that's why this family is this test case for this David model of robot or mecha. And he's attempting to create a bond with her. And the one thing that I pulled from their interactions, because that's only for half the movie, the rest of the movie really is about another adventure until the very end, when Monica is brought back into the picture. But the interactions that David and Monica have with each other are an attempt to build a relationship with a person that I use person very broadly there, with a person that that didn't make those connections, as you said, with the use of oxytocin. So I kind of see that David was at a disadvantage here, because not only is this idea of a mecha coming in to quote unquote replace my sick son, but also I don't know anything about him. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with him. I don't know how to make a bond with this child. Like, I mean, a lot of women and fathers too, I guess. A lot of people like holding babies because they get that squirt of oxytocin and it just makes them feel good. And there's not this connection with David, between Monica and David. Yeah, sure, they hug and they embrace and everything like that, but it's not the same as a child growing from a small baby into, a 10-year-old.
Yeah, so I think that's clear. It's not the same. I think that a parent's love for a natural born child that they have from birth is pretty. You can't really compare it to anything. However, there are different versions of love, and I think that little girls genuinely love their dolls. I think that it is not a meaningless emotion. It's not the same as a parent loving a child, but they will cry if you hurt the doll. Right. They will, I think they really do love it. People love pets. People love 10-year-old children that they adopt, and they don't get that early. You can learn to love people and you can learn to love objects.
Sure.
And it's not the same as a real kid. It's not the same as a real kid. And the same with Monica. She, doesn't love David as much as she loves Martin. That's for sure.
I think the difference here that I'm trying to explain is that it's not the same as adopting a 10-year-old child. It's, can you love a robot that was meant to replace your child?
Like anybody?
And that question is answered in this movie. And the answer appears to be no, because it's not. To Monica, David's not real enough to not send him to his quote unquote death.
I think she loves him, but not as much as she loves Martin. And I don't think it's because he's not human. I think it's because he does things that are dangerous and unpredictable. And I think that if it had a little bit more of Gigolo Joe's code, Martin would have loved him too, and they would have ended up being, it would have been fine. You wouldn't have had a plot.
Yeah.
It would have been a Hallmark movie.
Imagine the different kind of film that would be. Oh my goodness. We're all just one happy family.
I think I think to the extent that you and I are disagreeing about this, it's only a matter of
yeah, I think degree.
Like we both agree that, Monica doesn't have the same feelings for David as Martin. Maybe I think she loves him a little bit more than you do. An interesting data point though is what the what they're called the specialists, I think. The specialists were the mechas at the very end who bring Monica back. And the way they describe it is a little strange, that her memories are stored in space-time. And that's curious. So they reconstruct her body from DNA in the hair, and then they reconstruct her memories from some representation that's out in the universe somehow.
David, I often felt a sort of envy of human beings, of that thing they called spirit. Human beings had created a million explanations of the meaning of life in art, in poetry, in mathematical formulas. Certainly human beings must be the key to the meaning of existence, but human beings no longer existed. So, we began a project that would make it possible to recreate the living body of a person long dead from the DNA in a fragment of bone or mummified skin. We also wondered, would it be possible to retrieve a memory trace in resonance with a recreated body? And you know what we found? We found the very fabric of space-time itself appeared to store information about every event which had ever occurred in the past. But the experiment was a failure. For those who were resurrected only lived through a single day of renewed life. When the resurrectees fell asleep on the night of their first new day, they died again. As soon as they became unconscious, their very existence faded away into darkness. So you see, David, the equations had shown that once an individual space-time pathway had been used, it could not be reused. If we bring your mother back now, it will only be for one day, and then you will never be able to see her again.
But her behavior during this one day that David gets with her at the end, there's no ever asking about Martin or Henry or any of this stuff. So did they remove some of the memories? Like, it doesn't seem to be completely her, but to the extent that it is her, she says, "I love you" to David. She treats him like a real son. She delights in him. And, as far as she passes the love Turing test, in my opinion. So to the extent that those are actually her memories that are motivating her behavior in that last day, in the third act, I think there is love for him. I think he's under an illusion. I think that David's opinion that he would be loved more if he were a real boy is a bit mistaken. I think that if he were a real boy that did all those things to Martin, grabbed him and sunk him to the bottom of a pool, showed up with scissors, I think that it would also be a fraught relationship.
I mean, I agree. I think, I guess I'm slightly more cynical about the end, even though the end feels good. And as the viewer, sort of meant to be like, oh, okay, David got his last hurrah, essentially, because he was under this just supreme quest to find the blue fairy to make him real, and then Monica will love him and all of that. Obviously a misguided sentiment, even from a mecha that should, for all intents and purposes, be able to compute things a lot quicker and faster, unless they're, handicapped for some reason in this world. But I'm a little bit more cynical about the end, because the end to me represents a fantasy for David. And regardless of what we're told by the specialist and the recreation of Monica and the fact that her consciousness will float away after, quote unquote, float away after a day of hanging out, I think that was just a bunch of wish fulfillment for David. And her saying, "I love you," did not represent what the real Monica would ultimately say if they lived together forever. It was just David getting one last day from the blue fairy.
Well, so do you think that the specialist just created Monica out of nothing and manipulated her behaviors, and they weren't based on her psychology.
Yeah, I think they cloned her from her hair.
That is a very dark interpretation.
Yeah, I think they cloned her DNA and they lied.
You're right. So I mean, there's no evidence of that. I'm not saying it's not true, but
Right.
They say that, we're getting this. So basically, you're saying that the whole thing about getting memory from space or whatever is, well, but then how would she even know the layout of her own house? Like, I guess they could have programmed that in, but it seems like, I don't know. It seems weird. Like, they would have to know a lot of things. Maybe they got it from David.
Yeah,
they did read his brain. Yeah, so maybe, yeah. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but
it is a dark.
I think it's a very dark.
I don't disagree with you that it's a very dark and
that's
cynical
a dark ending, but
interpretation.
It's dark and cynical, and I think you're reading a lot into it, but
I do with movies.
I do also think that even without that interpretation, the ending is incredibly dark. Like,
I mean, just from a human standpoint,
it's revealed that David
2,000 years and all we have left is
from
nothing.
Like even David's standpoint. Oh no, you've got mechas. That's fine. But you've got David clearly cares about nobody on Earth except for Monica. So like he just. All the humans are dead, just blows by him. And all he cares about is getting love for his mother. He's like the most obsessed. All he cares about is one thing. He's just looking for one thing. And, and then it's unclear what happens. But like, is he going to live for another 2,000 years without Monica? Does he die at the end? And then what happens to Teddy? Like, it's a very... I think that getting one more day of love from Monica is, for a potentially eternal being, not a great ending.
Yeah, it definitely leaves a lot of open questions. Like, wait, they're ending it now? What? No. We need to know what David's new obsession is. That's what his quest was. It was an obsession, of course. And he engaged in compulsive behaviors.
Yeah.
It's an interesting take. And I don't think that Steven Spielberg intended to answer any of those questions, which is why he ends it where he does. Sort of tie nice little bow on it. It's when I read that you thought the ending was dark, albeit I one-upped you on that one. But when I read that you said the ending was dark, I thought to myself, well, that's actually quite a change from quite a few Spielberg movies. He tends to leave endings of his films ambiguous, but on a high note. And I don't think he intended this one to be thought as a dark ending. But it is truly dark because David is obsessed with Monica. And he is obsessed with finding that blue fairy. And he does everything in his power to do so, even diving down into the depths and just repeating it over and over and over again.
I mean, this ending was in Kubrick's story.
That's interesting to note. Okay.
If he rewrote the script, but like the basic beats of the story are all Kubrick.
Okay.
People actually criticized him about like making the ending saccharine and Spielbergy, but he was just like, "Hey, that's Kubrick." Maybe he filmed it in a sentimental way.
I think he did. I think Steven Spielberg has no choice but to end his movies in like a high note, whereas Kubrick can end his movies on a very, very, very seemingly high note, but it's actually quite devilish at the end, like Clockwork Orange, for example.
I think that this counts as that too. This movie counts as that too, because I think if you don't think about the ending very much, it feels happy. It ends with pleasant music and the lights slowly dimming, and then you're like, what happens? What happens when the lights go out? Like, what movie I just popped into my mind is The Graduate, where the very end of The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman's character goes and breaks up this wedding and inconveniences so many people and grabs the girl, and they get on the bus and they're just sitting on the bus smiling, and they hold that for a little bit of an uncomfortable time, and then the credits roll. But then you're just like, what happens in the next half an hour that they're on this bus? Where the hell are, and are they going to make a life now? Like, the story's not over. It's just, it's an impulsive young person thing to do. But I like that. You peel a layer back and you're like, oof.
I agree.
This is
I
nasty.
agree. Okay. One last tidbit that you wanted to share with the listeners about this movie. Anything that we've talked about here, go for it.
Can we talk about
Go
Teddy?
for it. Yeah, Teddy. Creepy character.
Right. Teddy, so from the Pinocchio, you think he's creepy? I love him. I don't think he's creepy at all. I think, so Teddy, from the Pinocchio perspective, is sort of the Jiminy Cricket character, and he does help David a little bit. I think he's underused. He's kept in the movie mostly to give the lock of hair at the end, which I don't think he was.
Yeah, he acts as a very, very MacGuffin-y kind of character.
Yeah, but David could have easily just had the lock of hair in his pocket the whole time. I don't know why. And there are long sequences where he doesn't talk. David's just carrying him around. He doesn't say anything. In Dr. No, he's just sitting in the back, looking around. And so he helps David a little bit, but not a whole lot. But he's a really interesting. And I think that one of the things that makes him fascinating is the voice actor they used to play him. And he was told to deliver it in a gravelly, grown-up voice. Like, I feel like many other directors would have given him like a cutesy little voice, but he's got this like, serious, like almost like in a world kind of voice. And it's a little, it's strange, but it gives him a kind of a gravitas, I think. And, and then one thing that David does, he obviously has affection for Teddy because he's always bringing him along. And he asks, when Monica says, let's go out in the woods, he says, with Teddy. And then, so he like, if he wants nothing more than to be with Monica, why did he ask for Teddy to come along? So I feel like he's got some kind of relationship, some bond with Teddy, maybe because he's the only other mecha in the house. But then you read these letters that he wrote to Monica that say, I love you and Martin, but not Teddy, because Teddy's not real.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. So it's like he's distinguishing himself from the other mechas on the one hand, but he loves Teddy in the other. And I just watching Teddy is one of my favorite parts of this.
Yeah, I say he's creepy, but like I love the way the voice actor played this role. It's not what you're expecting. You're like, at the first moment he opens his mouth, you're like, wait a minute. But how he so calmly takes the lock of hair out 2,000 years later. You remember when the lock of hair? I was like, whoa, buddy. That was an interesting thing to get. That was an interesting thing to walk into that room and pick that up. Yeah, unexplained. Teddy was an interesting character, if not just advancing the plot along. The last thing that I want to leave the listeners with is the opening narration from the specialists, who narrates the beginning part of the movie, is slightly in the middle, and then at the end. 2001, this movie is being filmed, 2000, whatever, when this stuff came out, or when they were recording lines for it, I imagine. And the whole intro to the 22nd century is what we are living right now with climate change. The fact that the 22nd century came in with massively high sea levels, drowning coastal cities in hundreds of feet of water, and that we are currently on the precipice of that 21 years later. I'm just like, okay, somebody was a soothsayer there. But you pointed out something interesting about even that, Jim. What was that?
Well, yeah, so it seems like it's prescient. I mean, those ideas they're coming to the fore around that time. It was sort of the disaster we were all seeing. But I looked at the dates because I noticed the Twin Towers are part of some of the buildings that are still sticking out. And this movie came out only a few months before the attacks on the Twin Towers. So think about how I don't remember this, but I just imagine how disturbing it must have been for people to go to this movie and to see
indeed,
the World Trade
or
Center
seeing it
sticking
after
out.
it came out in theaters.
If only. So like,
yeah.
So
just like with a lot of movies that have came out before September 2001, and have the Twin Towers in the skyline, and you're just like, oh. But this one saying, 2,000 a year, or almost 2,100 years later, we have frozen covered New York, but the two Twin Towers are sticking out at the top there. Quite wild. Quite wild.
Yeah. And it's so I think that this is part of the DNA of the movie. So the backstory of this is that there have been terrible climactic damages that have caused resource depletion to the point where you can only have a child if you have a license.
Right.
So this is the market for Davies. Right. This is one of the reasons that the company thinks that they're going to make money, is that these robots presumably use they'll use fewer resources than an actual child, or it's a loophole in the law. But he thinks that people who can't get a license can possibly have this. Now, I mean, I feel like I'm criticizing this movie a lot. I mean, I adore this movie, so I don't want people to get the impression I don't like it. But it doesn't seem like an overpopulated place.
It does not.
Like, especially the Monica and Henry live in apparent luxury, and that all their drives are in this gorgeous Oregon wilderness with nobody around. It's like, why exactly are we restricting reproduction in this world?
Yeah. Tell me about it. Like, there's a lot of space. There seems to be still a lot of space, you guys. Not everyone has to live on the coast.
Yeah, and even in Rouge City, Rouge City appears to be crowded, but no more crowded than Las Vegas on a given day. And there weren't tons of homeless people around either. So where's the poverty? Like, it's a strange kind of thing, but that's sort of how this, this is how it's a post-apocalyptic movie. It's got two apocalypses.
Two apocalypses, exactly.
One before the movie and one between Act 2 and 3.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Jim Davies for joining me to discuss AI, artificial intelligence. Before we say goodbye, Jim, is there anything that you'd like to plug? I know I mentioned some books at the beginning, but is there anything else out there that people can find out more about you and your work?
Sure. You can get information about me, my books, my podcast, social media links at jimdavies.org. That's Davies, jimdavies.org. And I have a podcast called Minding the Brain that I co-host with Dr. Kim Hellemans, who's a neuroscientist. And I talk about the cog-sci aspect, and she talks about the neuroscience aspect. And it's doing pretty well, and it's a lot of fun. So if you like podcasts, which I know you do,
I am definitely going to take a look at that. And listener, please do as well. I will link jimdavies.org in the show notes so you can easily find him. So thank you again, Jim, for joining me on this. I had so much fun. It was fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. I'd come back.
I would love that. And listener, that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.